Spencer Stuart is our expert on books and publishing, and he sometimes arrives on the anniversary of a game-changing publication to talk about what made it such a big thing. This year is the 400th anniversary of a major and sometimes very controversial publication called the Pavier Quarto. It's a collection of plays by William Shakespeare, and a couple of plays that turned out not to be by Shakespeare. And it was named for its publisher, Thomas Pavier. It's also known by another name. That's the False Folio. Now, Spencer thinks that name might be a little mean-spirited and perhaps wrong, and he told me why. But to understand the False Folio, you have to understand something first about what's called the First Folio.
Of this book is to kind of discuss Shakespeare in his time. You know, how we know Shakespeare is really through the First Folio. It's this kind of massive monolithic thing. I think it's bigger than monolithic. We need to find another word for it. But, you know, it's 36 plays, 18 of which debut with the First Folio. It's a project that took 2 years, and it was published in 1623. And it was put together by two of his co-workers, or people that he worked with Chamberlain's Men, which was the theater group he was with.
Oh, okay.
So to step back a little bit, you know, at the time in which Shakespeare's working, his relationship with printers is not really what we'd imagine it to be. You know, you're not seeing a gentleman sort of sitting down and writing and getting things published. He's tied up very much in the theater world. You know, he's someone who, it's a fierce competitive environment. He has to churn out his plays for the masses. The runs are really short. There's about, you know, roughly 10 runs for one play.
Oh, my.
Things are turning over quickly. And in terms of the printed word at that time and Shakespeare's output, you really would only he would have been known more for his poems than for his play publishing. Now, at that same time, the printing world in Britain, even though this is such a massive part of Western literature, it's shocking how little still exists and how small it actually was. So during the Elizabethan period, printers are kind of in a guild. They're in a stationer's company, and there's a hierarchy within this. And what happens is you have people up at the top, who are printing Bibles, law books, theology, things of this nature, and they control the kind of rights to publish those books. And they're usually always in the format of a folio, meaning you have a sheet of paper and you fold it once. And it's controlled very much by Queen Elizabeth at this point in time. So what happens is that lower on the rung are the plays. So it's something that's not seen as a high art in any way. It's seen as kind of ephemera. This is just one of the reasons why there's not really much surviving today.
Right, it's printed so that players could read their parts.
Exactly.
And then it's gone.
It's mostly it's almost like a ladder to just get to somewhere and then it's discarded or it's forgotten because they're moving on. And they're mostly printed in quarto format. Because
what does that mean?
It means that you fold it twice.
Okay.
So when you fold it twice, it creates 4 leaves. So and it's a smaller size generally. From a regular sheet of paper that the printers would have been using, it's about 5 inches by 7 inches average. So what's happening at this time is only in London can they print. It's been controlled by the monarchy so that it's only there. Oxford and Cambridge have their own printing presses, but that's kind of an exception to the rule. And you have to register with the stationers before you start any kind of project. And so at that period of time, around the turn from the 1500s into the 1600s, you have basically only 20 printers. And in Britain itself, in London, you have only 50 printing presses.
Only 50?
That's right.
Wow.
So to put this in perspective, at the same time in Amsterdam, there were printers that actually had that many in their one shop.
Huh.
So, this is an incredibly kind of small environment.
Very controlled, like you say.
Extremely controlled. The other thing is that when the First Folio comes out in 1623, there's a preface that's written by Henry Condell and John Hemming, who were both these actors that Shakespeare worked with. In the preface, they talk about all of the various imitation plays of Shakespeare's that kind of maim the body of work. and that the First Folio in many ways is a kind of complete portrayal of Shakespeare himself. So this is the environment that the Pavier Quarto is created. This is how it comes back to that. During the early 20th century, you have a number of people who start to study Shakespeare's books and the textual variations and the various different editions prior to the First Folio. And it's a period known as the New Bibliographers. And one of these gentlemen, kind of the pioneer of this new form, is a gentleman by the name of Alfred Pollard, who's a British bibliographer, who finds basically 9 plays in quarto form, 8 of which have title pages that are connected to William Shakespeare. And they date from 1600 to 1619. Now,
are these plays that we've known? Were these plays that we've known as Shakespeare?
Some of them, so like Merry Wives of Windsor, things like this. But then there are other ones that are, seen as that the attribution was somewhat questionable, and then it actually changes with time. So basically, there was this conclusion that was held by these new bibliographers that this was done under nefarious circumstances, that he was trying to capitalize on the death of William Shakespeare. And so he was sort of putting together 5 plays that he had the rights to, and then he put together 4 other ones and then tried to sell it as an anthology. Now, this kind of falls apart as a theory, and this has only recently been discussed within the scholarship because, first of all, Thomas Pavier, although he was producing theater plays, which were seen as like somewhat of a lowly publishing endeavor, he was actually very well respected within the Register's company. So he had quite a bit to lose if he was caught trying to do this.
Right, yeah.
Scholars have now actually looked at the texts themselves. And what they've found is that, as opposed to earlier quartos around the 1600s of William Shakespeare's, there's been considerable alteration to the actual text.
Oh, okay.
So this kind of changes the whole thing.
How interesting that something that was a theory for quite a considerable amount of time is suddenly blown out of the water.
That's right. And what basically happens is that, so if we start with that theory from the turn in early 20th century, that he's just trying to make a quick buck, why would he sit down, clean up the layout, start to actually clean up the stage cues so they're less towards working actors and more literary for a reader? And then also, why was he cleaning up certain genealogical inaccuracies from older editions? What it shows is an annotated reader, someone who isn't, they're not standing in the printing house as they're setting the type. Someone has come back and done considerable effort to clean it up. And so why the Pavier Quarto is an interesting phenomenon is that it's not so much something that's satisfying the demand of the people after the death of Shakespeare. What it is almost like a gauging of the popularity of Shakespeare before the larger project of the First Folio. So this is kind of the conclusion that people have reached
that this was
from studying it.
Like a test
publication? That's right.
Oh, okay.
So the thought is that after the publishing of the Quarto, a couple years later, the 2 actors, Hemming and Condell, approach Isaac Jaggard, who was the printer of the Pavier Quarto, and they start working together on the project of making the large First Folio. And often within the history of the First Folio, it's connected with Edward Blount, who was a major publisher at the time. But the reality is that prior to the First Folio, whenever he really had the copyrights for plays, he generally would let them go, or he'd pass them on to other publishers. It wasn't actually something he was particularly interested in. And so what it looks like is that the Pavier Quarto is something of an experiment maybe by Pavier, which was then kind of observed by Isaac, who was young, upstart printer working with his father, thought, okay, there's something here. And either through discussing with Hemming and Condell, or Condell and Hemming approaching him, they start to think maybe there's some legs here. Maybe this is a writer that's bigger than the plays. And the Pavier Quarto actually shows that a movement, a pretty major change in the texts of Shakespeare, from being something of a working copy for an actor with cues and things like this, towards something that you could read much like we do today.
So the calling it the False Folio, I guess, will have to stop, will it?
Yeah, exactly. Well, it is. Well, it's a false folio in many ways. Actually, it's kind of funny. First of all, it isn't a folio.
Right.
So this is always the giveaway there. But it is also a perception that you find even up until today in many ways, that the First Folio in some ways is the monolithic representation of Shakespeare's writing. And the truth is that he was a working writer. You know, there's something what surprises a lot of people is that there's so little evidence of that time in terms of writers in general, but especially Shakespeare. And one of the reasons is because he was a working guy, you know. Some of the evidence that we have of him existing is like deeds that he signed for a house,
right,
or when he gets involved with the king's men in 1594. You know, there's these kind of small little pieces of evidence. And over the time, what we find is this kind of almost a purification of his writing in a way. We're trying to keep it away from the fact that it's at the Globe Theatre and it's a kind of ruckus place, you know. So the Pavier Quarto is interesting because it's considered now to be one of the early instances before the First Folio of really trying to change his character, transforming Shakespeare from the playwright that people, you know, who had died and was someone of recent memory, towards someone who, you know, who becomes this like monolithic icon for us. What's also interesting is that the First Folio has always been an expensive book. It was £1 when it was first published in 1623.
When £1 would go a long way.
It's like a quarter of someone's salary, you know, an annual salary. It's an astronomical amount of money. You know, there was a certain amount of prestige that I think needed to be built around it. So the Pavier Quarto sort of functions to show an industry around the image of Shakespeare after his death, between his death in 1616 and 1623 when they published their First Folio. So it's sort of it's almost like a lab. It's a little bit of an exploration to see, okay, is this something that we can sell? What's interesting with Thomas Pavier is that he's testing it too, right? He has a couple of plays that he holds copyright to, so he could profit off of a bigger project later down the line. He's also a gentleman who has a great deal of history books in his back catalog as well. And it wasn't uncommon that people would connect history plays with nonfiction historical accounts of an event. So if the William Shakespeare bend didn't work, this kind of marketing it as the works of a single person, which was quite unusual for the time, he could then kind of put it together with history plays as well. And so it's an interesting moment in the printing of Shakespeare. And it's those early days, those periods of time where people are trying to figure out what's going on. So,
what a lot of sleuthing goes on.
Unbelievable. And it's interesting how the same evidence can lead to different conclusions. You know, so beginning of the century, you're looking at it. And it's seen as a kind of nefarious thing. It's seen as these publishers trying to make a quick buck. And then if you take a look at the actual work of the text and how the publisher's changing the content and editing slightly to make it palatable to readers or change the reception of it, it becomes a whole different thing. It becomes something that's very much familiar to us as the Shakespeare we know today.
That's Spencer Stuart, our books and publishing expert. And I love these peeks into these worlds where people are discussing such, I don't know, arcane things in a way, things that are mysteries over centuries, and then suddenly opinions change and evidence is looked at in a new way. So, the Pavier Quarto, I guess, False Folio no more, was published 400 years ago this year. And Spencer Stuart will be back in another month or so, and he's got some poetry publications on his mind for next time.